The reward notice went up on a Wednesday morning in October of 1851, nailed to the post outside the courthouse in Richmond, with a kind of deliberate public ceremony that men of power use when they want the world to know that something has made them afraid. It was printed on good paper, the expensive kind, which told you something about the man who had paid for it. The reward itself was $1,200, which in 1851 was enough to buy a small farm, a team of horses, and have money left over for a comfortable winter. It was the largest reward ever posted for a single escaped enslaved person in the Commonwealth of Virginia up to that date, and the men who gathered around that post on that Wednesday morning and read it carefully understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the number was not just a price. It was a measure of fear. The name on the notice was Solomon Greer. Below the name was a physical description: 6 feet and 2 inches tall, approximately 30 years of age, a scar along the left jawline from what the notice described as an industrial accident, unusually light eyes for a man of his complexion, gray or possibly green depending on the light, a detail that multiple witnesses had noted and that the notice's author had included because those eyes were the thing people remembered most after they had seen Solomon Greer, the thing that stayed with them after everything else about him had faded. The notice described him as extremely intelligent, which was not a phrase that appeared in reward notices with any regularity, and warned that he was not to be approached alone under any circumstances. At the bottom, in smaller type, was the name of the man posting the reward: Cornelius Aldgate, owner of Aldgate Iron Works, a foundry operation outside of Petersburg that was one of the largest industrial enterprises in the Commonwealth. A man of considerable wealth and considerable influence, with connections that reached from the Petersburg business community up through Richmond and into the offices of men who made decisions about how Virginia was governed. A man who was not accustomed to losing things. A man who was not accustomed to being made to look foolish. Solomon Greer had made him look very foolish indeed. But to understand what Solomon did and why it terrified Cornelius Aldgate in a way that went far beyond the loss of property or the blow to his pride, you have to understand what Solomon was before he became the most wanted man in Virginia. You have to go back to the beginning, to the iron works, to the years that made him. Because Solomon Greer did not become what he became despite what was done to him at Aldgate Iron Works. He became what he became because of it. Because there are places in this world that are designed to break people, and every once in a while they encounter someone who takes everything the breaking is meant to do and turns it into something the breakers never anticipated. Solomon was brought to Aldgate Iron Works in the spring of 1839 when he was approximately 18 years old. He had come from a tobacco plantation in Spotsylvania County, sold as part of a transaction that Cornelius Aldgate conducted with the plantation's owner in the same businesslike manner he used for the purchase of raw iron or coal. Aldgate Iron Works was an industrial operation rather than an agricultural one, which meant that the nature of the labor it required was different from field work in ways that were not entirely better, and in some ways considerably worse. The foundry ran on fire and iron, and the bodies of the men who worked it, and it consumed those bodies with an efficiency that matched anything Cornelius Aldgate had achieved in his ledgers. The work was brutal in a specific way. Not the grinding, weather-exposed brutality of field labor, but the concentrated, airless brutality of extreme heat and heavy metal and the constant proximity of machinery that would maim or kill without distinction or remorse. Men lost fingers, men lost hands, men lost their hearing gradually and then completely. The constant roar of the furnaces eating away at it year by year until the world became a place of movement without sound. Men died of heat exhaustion in the summer months at a rate that Aldgate recorded in his ledgers under the category of operational losses, with the same calm notation he used for broken equipment. Solomon arrived at the foundry in the spring and was put to work at the furnaces within a week. He was strong enough for the work and young enough to adapt to it, and he had from the first days a quality that the ironworks foreman, a free black man named Hector, who had been at Aldgate for 11 years, noticed immediately. Solomon learned, not just quickly, which was common enough among young men new to a skilled trade. He learned in a way that went beyond the task in front of him. He understood systems. He grasped the relationship between one part of the foundry's operation and another. The way the temperature of the furnace affected the quality of the pour, the way the quality of the pour affected the properties of the finished iron, the way the properties of the finished iron determined what it could be used for and therefore what it was worth. He understood these connections after weeks in a place where men who had worked for years sometimes still did not see them. Hector put him on more complex work within 3 months. By the end of his first year, Solomon was doing work that should have taken 5 years to qualify for, and doing it with a precision and a consistency that made the finished product coming out of his section of the foundry measurably better than what came from anywhere else. Hector reported this to Aldgate. Aldgate came to look. He watched Solomon work for perhaps 20 minutes, and then he walked away without saying anything. And Hector, who had worked for Cornelius Aldgate long enough to read him, understood that what he had just witnessed was the expression of a man filing something valuable away for future use. What Aldgate did with the information was characteristic of him. He did not improve Solomon's conditions. He did not acknowledge the quality of his work in any way that Solomon would have experienced as recognition. What he did was begin to depend on it. Silently, without announcement, he restructured the foundry's most profitable contracts around Solomon's section. The work that required the highest precision, the work that commanded the best prices from buyers who knew the difference between good iron and excellent iron, flowed toward Solomon's furnace. And the profits from that work flowed, as all profits at Aldgate Ironworks flowed, directly and entirely to Cornelius Aldgate. Solomon understood what was happening. He understood it with the same clarity with which he understood everything else about the foundry's systems. He was producing value that was not being acknowledged and would never be compensated. This was not a new understanding for an enslaved person in Virginia in the 1840s. It was the fundamental condition of his existence. But Solomon processed it differently from how most people in his situation processed it, not with despair or with rage, though he felt both of those things, but with attention. He paid attention to the gap between what he produced and what he received, and he stored that attention the way you store fuel, letting it accumulate, keeping it dry, waiting for the moment when it would be useful. That moment came in the winter of 1844, 5 years after his arrival at the ironworks. It came in the form of a conversation he was not meant to hear. Cornelius Aldgate had a business partner named Marsh, a man who supplied raw materials to the foundry and who visited several times a year to review the operation and settle accounts. On a January evening, Aldgate and Marsh were in the foundry office conducting one of these reviews, and Solomon was working late in the section, adjacent to the office wall, close enough in the relative quiet of the late evening to hear, through the thin partition, the substance of what was being discussed. What he heard was a negotiation. Aldgate and Marsh were discussing a new contract, a large one, with a buyer in Baltimore who wanted a specific grade of iron for a specific application. The grade they were discussing was one that Solomon had spent 2 years perfecting. The price they were discussing was extraordinary, and in the course of the negotiation, Aldgate described the production capacity of his foundry in terms that Solomon recognized as accurate in every respect except one. Aldgate did not mention that the capacity he was describing was dependent on a single person. He spoke of it as a general property of the operation, something inherent to the foundry itself rather than something located in the knowledge and skill of one man at one furnace. Solomon kept working. He kept his face toward the furnace and his hands on his tools, and he let the conversation wash over him, and he stored every word of it in that precise and capacious memory of his. He did not change his behavior at the foundry after that evening. He came to work, he did his work, he produced the iron that Aldgate's most profitable contracts depended on, and he gave no outward sign that anything had shifted inside him. But something had shifted. The gap between what he produced and what he received had just been given a number, a very large number. And Solomon, who understood systems, had begun to understand something about this particular system that Cornelius Aldgate had not considered. A system that depends on one person and does not know that it depends on one person is not as strong as it believes itself to be. Hector noticed the change in Solomon, the same way Bess had noticed the quality of Iris's stillness, with the instinct of someone who has learned to read people carefully because their survival has depended on it. He did not ask Solomon directly what he was thinking. He asked him one evening as they were banking the furnaces for the night whether he was all right. Solomon said he was fine. He said he was thinking about iron. Hector looked at him. He said that was a strange thing to be thinking about at the end of a 12-hour day. Solomon said he meant he was thinking about what iron becomes when you change the conditions of the pour. He said that the same material under different conditions produces something entirely different. He said that was interesting to him. Hector looked at him for a long moment. Then he went back to banking the furnace and said nothing more. But later, walking home in the cold January dark, he thought about what Solomon had said, and he felt something move through him that he recognized after a while as the particular unease of a man who has just understood that something is going to happen and cannot see its shape clearly enough to know whether it will be good or terrible or both at once. It would be both. He was right about that. The years between 1844 and 1851 were the years in which Solomon Greer built the thing that would make Cornelius Oldgate nail that notice to the courthouse post on a Wednesday morning in October and spend the rest of his professional life trying to explain to his creditors why his most profitable contracts had suddenly become impossible to fulfill. What Solomon built in those 7 years was knowledge. Specific, technical, irreplaceable knowledge about the production of a particular grade of iron that only one foundry in Virginia was currently producing. Knowledge that lived entirely inside his own head and could not be extracted, transferred, or replicated without him. He did this deliberately. He consolidated. Where the production process had previously involved several men, each understanding their own piece, Solomon reorganized it, subtly and over time, so that the critical knowledge, the specific adjustments of temperature and timing and material composition that produced the grade Oldgate's best contracts required, existed completely and only in his own understanding. He did not sabotage anyone else. He did not take anything from his fellow workers. He simply became, piece by piece and year by year, the only person at Oldgate Ironworks who knew how to do the thing that Oldgate Ironworks was most expensively paid to do. And then, on a moonless night in September of 1851, he walked away. He did not run. That was the first thing that confounded the men who were sent to find him in the days after his disappearance. Every protocol for the pursuit of an escaped enslaved person was built around the assumption of running, of a person moving fast and desperately through the night, making decisions under panic, leaving traces in the landscape that a practiced tracker could follow. The reward notices, the patrols, the network of checkpoints that Virginia had developed over decades for exactly this purpose, all of it was designed to catch a person in flight. Solomon was not in flight. He had not been in flight for 7 years. He had been in preparation. The night he left the ironworks, he walked. He walked at a steady pace, not fast enough to attract attention if anyone saw him, not slow enough to waste the darkness he had. He carried almost nothing, a small bundle of food he had accumulated over the previous 2 weeks, in amounts too small for anyone to notice, a set of clothes he had obtained through a chain of exchanges so indirect and so patient that no single person in the chain knew what they had contributed to, and the document. The document was the most important thing he carried. It was a letter of passage written on good paper in a confident, educated hand, identifying the bearer as a free man of color named James Greer, employed as a foundry consultant, traveling to Richmond on behalf of his employer. It named a real foundry in Philadelphia as the employer, one that Solomon had learned about through years of listening to the conversations of men who came to Oldgate on business from the north. The letter was signed with a name that was not entirely fabricated, a variation on the name of a real Philadelphia businessman that was close enough to be convincing to someone who did not know the original well, and different enough to be deniable if it ever came to that. Solomon had written the letter himself. He had been practicing the handwriting for 8 months. He had also, in those same 8 months, been practicing something else: speech. Not the elimination of his accent, which would have been both impossible and suspicious, but the modulation of it, the conscious adjustment of register and vocabulary and cadence that would allow him, in the right circumstances, to present himself as a man of education and professional standing. He had been listening to the way educated men spoke for years at the ironworks, the buyers who came from Baltimore and Philadelphia and Richmond, the lawyers and engineers and businessmen who moved through Aldgate's office with the comfortable authority of people who had never had to think about whether they belonged in a room. He had catalogued their speech the way he had catalogued everything else, noting what they said and how they said it, and what the effect of it was on the people around them. He understood that the document and the speech were two parts of the same instrument. Separately, each one was fragile. Together they created something more durable, a performance of legitimacy that most people, most of the time, would not look behind, because looking behind it required a willingness to be impolite that most people in ordinary social situations did not possess. He reached Richmond before dawn. He did not try to leave the city immediately. He knew that the roads out of Richmond in the first days after a disappearance would be the most dangerous. Aldgate would have sent riders north and west and south within hours of discovering him gone. The checkpoints would be active. The watchers would be watching. So Solomon stayed in Richmond. He found shelter in a neighborhood near the river where free black families lived in close proximity, a community dense enough to absorb one more person without the addition being immediately visible. He had a contact there, a woman named Clara, who was the wife of a free laborer and who had been part of a network of people in Richmond who helped those making their way out of bondage. The connection to Clara had been established over 2 years through a chain of communication so careful and so patient that it would have been invisible to anyone who did not already know it existed. Clara took him in without a word. She gave him food and a place to sleep and the information he needed about the current state of the roads and the patrols. She had been doing this long enough to know that the first week was always the most dangerous, and that the men who survived it were the ones who did not move when movement was the obvious thing to do. Solomon stayed with Clara and her family for 9 days. He was not idle. In those 9 days he did something that no one who later tried to reconstruct his movements fully accounted for, something that would only become apparent in the months and years that followed, when Cornelius Aldgate began to understand the full dimensions of what had been done to him. Solomon spent those 9 days writing. He wrote in the back room of Clara's house, by lamplight, in the careful, precise hand he had developed over years of practice. He wrote out, in complete and exhaustive detail, everything he knew about the production of the iron grade that Aldgate's most profitable contracts depended on. Every temperature, every timing, every adjustment of material composition, every variable, and how to control it. He wrote it the way an engineer writes a specification, with the thoroughness of a man who intends the document to be used by someone who has never seen the process, who needs to be able to replicate it from the words alone without any additional guidance. He wrote 3 copies. When he was finished, he gave 1 copy to Clara, with instructions for how it was to be held and under what circumstances it was to be used. The 2nd copy he carried with him when he left Richmond on the 10th day. The 3rd copy had already been sent through the network to a destination he did not share with Clara, because he understood that the safest information is information that no single person holds completely. Clara asked him, the evening before he left, why he had written it down. She said she had helped many people through her house over the years, and none of them had spent their time writing technical documents. Solomon said that what he carried in his head was his most valuable possession and also his most dangerous one. He said that as long as the knowledge existed only in his head, Aldgate had every reason in the world to find him and bring him back. A living Solomon was the only way to recover what had been lost. But if the knowledge existed somewhere else, in a form that could be used without him, then his value as a recovered piece of property dropped considerably, and the calculation Aldgate was making about how much to spend on finding him might change. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said that was either very clever or very dangerous, and she was not sure there was a difference. Solomon said there wasn't. He left Richmond on a Tuesday morning in early October, traveling north on a route that Clara's network had used before, but that was varied in its specific details each time it was used, because the people who maintained it understood that a route used identically enough times eventually becomes a route that someone else knows. He traveled as James Greer, foundry consultant, and he used the letter, the speech, and the posture and the register of a man who belongs wherever he is standing, and in the small towns and at the crossings and checkpoints between Richmond and the Maryland border. He was questioned 4 times and passed through all 4 times without being detained. The 4th questioning was the closest. A deputy sheriff in a small town whose name Solomon never recorded stopped him on the road and looked at the letter of passage with an attention that suggested either genuine suspicion or the kind of thoroughness that some men apply to official duties out of temperament rather than specific cause. He asked Solomon questions about the Philadelphia foundry named in the letter. Solomon answered them. The deputy asked him to describe his employer. Solomon described a man he had constructed from fragments of real people he had observed over years, a description detailed enough to be convincing and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. The deputy handed back the letter and waved him through. Solomon walked another 100 yards down the road before he allowed himself to breathe normally. He crossed into Maryland on a Thursday evening and was in Pennsylvania by the following Monday. He reached Philadelphia in the 3rd week of October, 1851, approximately 5 weeks after he had walked away from Aldgate Ironworks on a moonless September night. In Philadelphia, he did 3 things in quick succession. He found the community of free black people that had been described to him by Clara and by others in the network. A community that had been receiving people making the journey north for years, and that had developed, out of necessity, a sophisticated capacity for absorbing new arrivals and helping them establish themselves. He made contact with a man named Douglas Hale, a free black businessman who had interests in several industries, including, critically, metalworking. And he presented Douglas Hale with the 2nd copy of the document he had written in Clara's back room in Richmond. Hale read it over 2 evenings. He was not himself a foundry man, but he knew enough about the iron trade to understand what he was reading and to understand its value. He had a contact, a foundry owner in western Pennsylvania named Grierson, who had been trying for 3 years to produce a grade of iron that a specific set of buyers kept requesting and that he had not been able to achieve consistently. Hale sent the document to Grierson. Grierson read it. Then he asked to meet the man who had written it. The meeting took place in November of 1851, 6 weeks after Solomon's arrival in Philadelphia. Grierson was a practical man with a practical man's directness. He said he had read the document twice and that if it was accurate, it described a production process that his foundry did not currently have and that he wanted. He asked Solomon if he was willing to come to western Pennsylvania and implement it. Solomon said he was willing to discuss terms. Grierson looked at him. He said he had not expected that phrase. Solomon said he imagined not. The terms they agreed on over the following week were, by any standard of the time and place, extraordinary. Solomon would receive a salary. A real salary paid in money for work that was acknowledged as skilled and compensated accordingly. He would have housing. He would have the legal protections available to a free man of color in Pennsylvania, which were imperfect and incomplete, but which were real in a way that nothing in Virginia had ever been real for him. And his name on the employment agreement would be Solomon Greer. His own name, the name he had carried through everything, the name that was on the reward notice nailed to the post outside the Richmond courthouse, used openly and without apology, in a state where Cornelius Aldgate's reach did not extend and where the document Aldgate had filed with Virginia authorities had no legal force. He arrived at Grierson's foundry in December of 1851. He implemented the production process he had written down in Clara's back room. It worked. It worked with the same precision it had worked with at Aldgate Ironworks, because the knowledge was in Solomon's hands and in Solomon's understanding, and those things had traveled north with him intact. Within 8 months, Grierson's foundry was producing the grade of iron that the buyers had been requesting and that nobody else in the region could reliably deliver. Within a year, the contracts were signed and the money was flowing. And Grierson, who was a man of his word, paid Solomon what they had agreed. In Richmond, Cornelius Aldgate was having a very different experience. The discovery of Solomon's absence had come on the morning after he left, when the furnace supervisor arrived and found the section empty and the fire banked for what was clearly an extended rather than a temporary absence. Aldgate was notified within the hour. He responded with the organized fury of a man who has had something taken from him that he did not know he valued until it was gone. He sent riders in 4 directions. He filed the reward notice. He contacted the network of slave catchers that operated throughout Virginia and into Maryland with the efficiency of men who had turned human pursuit into a professional service. None of it produced Solomon. What it produced over the following weeks was a growing awareness of the problem that Solomon had anticipated and that the document in Clara's possession was designed to address. Aldgate's foundry could not fill its most profitable contracts without the production process that Solomon had taken with him. He brought in other workers and tried to reconstruct it. He hired a consultant from Richmond who knew ironwork in a general way, but not in the specific way that mattered. He spent money he had not planned to spend trying to reverse engineer a process that he had never fully understood because he had never needed to understand it, because the person who understood it had been standing at his furnace every day, and Aldgate had been too confident in his ownership of that person to ever consider what it would mean to lose him. The contracts began to fail, not immediately and not all at once, but in the steady, grinding way that business failures happen when a critical capability disappears and cannot be replaced. Buyers who had been receiving consistent quality began receiving inconsistent quality. Some of them waited, some of them did not. By the spring of 1852, 2 of the 3 largest contracts that depended on Solomon's process had been redirected to other suppliers. By the summer, the 3rd had followed. Aldgate's losses in that period were substantial enough that he began to understand, with a clarity that the reward notice had not given him, what had actually happened. This had not been an escape. It had been a dismantling. A careful, patient, years-long dismantling of the most profitable part of his operation, conducted from the inside by a man he had owned and underpaid and depended on, and never once looked at directly enough to see. He increased the reward. He sent men further north. He wrote letters to business contacts in Philadelphia and Baltimore, asking them to watch for a man matching Solomon's description. Nothing came back. Because Solomon was not in Philadelphia. He was in western Pennsylvania, in a town small enough that strangers were noticed and established residents were not, working under his own name in a foundry that had no connection to anyone in Aldgate's network, producing iron of a quality that was making Grierson's reputation in the regional market and earning Solomon a salary that he saved with the same careful deliberateness he had applied to everything else in his life. He had been building toward something. He had been building toward it since that January evening in 1844, when he had stood at his furnace and listened to Aldgate and Marsh negotiate a contract in the next room, and understood, with the precision of a man who thinks in systems, what his situation actually was and what it would take to change it. Bess had built a legal case, Iris had built a legal case, Solomon had built something different, something that was in its own way just as architectural and just as deliberate. He had built a transfer of value. He had taken the thing that made him most useful to the man who owned him, and he had moved it, piece by piece over 7 years, from a place where it could be exploited without his consent to a place where it could only be accessed with it. He had not destroyed Aldgate Ironworks. He had not tried to. What he had done was more precise than destruction. He had removed from it the specific thing that made it most valuable and installed that thing somewhere else, somewhere that paid him for it, somewhere that acknowledged what it was worth and who it belonged to. It belonged to Solomon. It had always belonged to Solomon. Cornelius Aldgate had spent 12 years believing otherwise, and the reward notice on the courthouse post was, in the end, just the public record of the moment he found out he was wrong. Now I want to stop for just a moment and ask you something directly, because what comes next is the part of this story that the history books have almost entirely missed. The part that happened after Solomon was safe, after the salary was coming in and the contracts were signed, the part that he spent the rest of his life building toward with the same patience and the same precision he had brought to everything else. If you want to know what Solomon did with what he had, what he built in Pennsylvania, and how it reached back into Virginia in ways that Cornelius Aldgate felt for the rest of his life, follow this channel right now and tell me in the comments whether you think a man like Solomon ever stopped, whether you think the work was ever finished for him. Because the answer is not what you expect. He was not done. He had never intended to be done. Walking away from Aldgate Ironworks had not been the end of anything. It had been, as everything in Solomon Greer's life had been, the beginning of the next thing. The town was called Harwick. It sat in a valley in western Pennsylvania where two small rivers met and the land flattened out enough to build on, the kind of town that existed because geography had made it convenient rather than because anyone had chosen it with particular intention. It had a foundry, a feed store, 2 churches, a school that operated 4 days a week when the weather permitted, and a population of approximately 400 people, of whom perhaps 30 were black. Most of them free, most of them arrived within the previous decade from various points south by various routes that people in Harwick understood and did not discuss openly. Solomon arrived in December of 1851, and within 6 months he was no longer a newcomer in any meaningful sense. This was partly because of his work at Grierson's foundry, which established him quickly as someone whose presence in the town had practical value. It was partly because of the particular quality of his attention, the way he listened when people spoke, the way he remembered what they told him and referenced it later in ways that made people feel seen and considered. And it was partly because of something harder to name, a quality of steadiness that people in Harwick recognized without being able to articulate, the steadiness of a man who has decided exactly who he is and has no remaining anxiety about whether other people will accept it. He rented a room from a woman named Patience Arnold, a widow in her 60s who owned a house on the eastern edge of town and who supplemented her income by taking in boarders with the selectivity of someone who has learned through experience that not all income is worth what it costs. She looked Solomon over when he came to her door in the January cold and asked him 3 questions. She asked him whether he drank. He said not to excess. She asked him whether he kept late hours. He said not, as a habit. She asked him whether he kept late hours. He said not as a habit. She asked him whether he had people who would be looking for him. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said that the people looking for him were in Virginia and that their reach did not extend to Harwick. She considered this for what felt like a long time. Then she showed him the room. They developed, over the months that followed, the kind of relationship that forms between people who respect each other's privacy and share a practical understanding of how the world works. Patience Arnold had lived long enough and seen enough to have very few illusions about anything, and she recognized in Solomon someone who operated from a similar absence of illusion. She did not ask him about his past. He did not offer it. What they shared instead were the daily practicalities of a shared household, the morning coffee, the evening meal when their schedules aligned, the occasional conversation about the town and its people that was their way of building the kind of mutual knowledge that makes cohabitation comfortable. It was Patience who first told him about the school. She mentioned it one evening in the spring of 1852, in the tone she used for information she was offering rather than conversation she was making, a tone he had learned to pay attention to. She said the school had been without a proper teacher for the better part of a year. She said the woman who had been teaching had married and moved to Pittsburgh, and the replacement the town had found was a young man from Philadelphia who knew his subjects well enough but had no particular gift for the work and was, in her view, unlikely to stay. Solomon asked her why she was telling him. She said she had noticed that he read in the evenings. She said she had seen the books on his table, not liked reading, law books, history, a volume on engineering that she had never seen anyone read for pleasure before. She said she thought a man who read like that might have something to offer children who were not being well served by what was currently on offer. Solomon said he had no experience teaching. Patience said that in her experience, the people who were best at teaching were rarely the ones who had been trained for it, and almost always the ones who could not help doing it. He thought about this for several days. Then he went to the school. The arrangement he made with the town was informal at first, supplementary to what the young man from Philadelphia was doing. An extra session on Saturday mornings for children whose families wanted more than the 4-day week provided. The children who came to those Saturday sessions were a mixed group, white and black, ranging in age from 6 to 14, drawn by the same practical parental calculation that children everywhere are delivered to educational opportunities by the sense that something useful is on offer. What Solomon taught them was not what they expected. He taught reading and numbers, because those were the foundations without which nothing else was possible, and because he knew from his own experience what it cost a person to be without them. But he also taught them to think about systems. He taught them to look at how things worked, not just what they were. He taught them to ask why a thing was the way it was, rather than accepting the way it was as the only way it could be. He taught this not through abstract instruction, but through concrete problems, the kind that a child in a Pennsylvania valley town in 1852 actually encountered in daily life, problems about quantities and distances and costs and the logic of physical processes, and he embedded in the solutions to those problems the habit of mind that had kept him alive and moving forward through everything that had been done to him. The children who sat in those Saturday sessions and absorbed what Solomon was teaching would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Several of them would later describe it in terms that were almost identical to one another, despite the years and distances between their accounts. They said he taught them that every system has a logic, and every logic has a limit, and the limit is always where the most important things happen. They said he taught them this without ever using those words, through problems and questions and the patient refusal to give an answer when a student could find it themselves with a little more time and a little more thought. By the autumn of 1852, the Saturday sessions had grown large enough that the informal arrangement was no longer adequate. The town formalized it. Solomon became, with the practical efficiency that Harwick applied to most things, the school's second teacher, responsible for the older students and the Saturday sessions, and increasingly for the curriculum that the whole school followed, because the young man from Philadelphia, as Patience had predicted, did not stay. Solomon was 29 years old, or thereabouts. He had been free for just over a year. He was teaching school in western Pennsylvania and working at a foundry and saving money and reading law books in the evenings by lamplight, and to anyone watching from outside it might have looked like a man settling into a life, putting down roots, building something stable and quiet and earned. It was all of those things. It was also something else, because Solomon had not forgotten Virginia. He had not forgotten Aldgate Ironworks or the 12 years he had spent there, or the system that had made those 12 years possible. He had not forgotten the 37 other people who had been at the ironworks when he left, the men whose hearing was going or already gone, the men who had lost parts of themselves to machinery and heat, the men who were still there, still at those furnaces, still producing value for a man who recorded their losses in his ledger under operational costs. He had not forgotten them because he had not allowed himself to forget them. He kept them present in his mind with the same deliberateness with which he kept everything important present, as a fact that required a response, as an obligation that had not yet been discharged. The document he had left with Clara in Richmond had been the first piece of the response. The second piece had been establishing himself in Pennsylvania, building the stability and the resources and the connections that the next part of the work would require. He had understood from the beginning that what he was going to do could not be done from a position of desperation or instability. It required exactly what he had spent the past year building, a foundation. In the spring of 1853, Solomon made contact with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Theodore Marsh, no relation to the Marsh who supplied materials to Aldgate, a man who practiced in Pittsburgh and who had a reputation among the free black community of western Pennsylvania as someone who took seriously the legal challenges that community faced and who had the skill and the tenacity to pursue them effectively. Marsh was in his 40s, methodical and precise, with the kind of patience that complex legal work requires. and that not every lawyer who possesses intelligence also possesses. Solomon came to his office on a Tuesday morning with a document under his arm and sat down across the desk from Theodore Marsh and spent 2 hours explaining what he had spent 12 years learning about Aldgate Ironworks. He explained the labor conditions. He explained the mortality rate, the men who had died of heat exhaustion and been recorded as operational losses. He explained the injuries, the systematic nature of them, the way the foundry's operating procedures created conditions that made certain kinds of injury statistically inevitable, and that Aldgate had known this and had continued those procedures because the cost of the injuries, borne entirely by the men who suffered them, was lower than the cost of changing the procedures would have been to Aldgate. He explained all of this in the organized, evidenced, precise manner of a man who has been preparing the explanation for a long time. Then he put the document on the desk. The document was not the technical iron production specification he had written in Clara's back room. That document had served its purpose and was now being used at Grierson's foundry to produce iron and revenue. This document was something different. It was a record. A detailed, dated, specific record of conditions at Aldgate Ironworks, going back 12 years, built from Solomon's memory, which was the kind of memory that stored details with the fidelity of a written account and supplemented by information he had gathered through the network of contacts he had maintained since his arrival in Pennsylvania, contacts who were themselves connected to people still in Virginia, people who could confirm current conditions and update the record with recent events. Marsh read it over 2 evenings. When he came back to Solomon, he said that what he had been given was remarkable and that what could be done with it was limited, not by its quality, but by the legal landscape of 1853, which offered very narrow avenues for addressing the conditions Solomon was describing. He said he could not file a case in Virginia. He said the federal courts were not a realistic option given the current composition of the bench and the current political climate. He said the direct legal path, the path that Solomon had perhaps been hoping for, was largely closed. Solomon said he understood that. He said he had not come to Marsh looking for a direct path. He said he had come because he needed a lawyer who understood what was possible and what was not, and who could help him find the thing that was possible, even when it was not the obvious thing. Marsh looked at him. He asked Solomon what he thought was possible. Solomon said he thought pressure was possible, not legal victory, not yet, but pressure. He said that Aldgate's business depended on contracts with buyers in the North, buyers in Pennsylvania and Maryland and New York, who were making their own calculations about what they could afford to be associated with as the political climate around slavery shifted and the pressure from abolition movements increased. He said that a documented account of conditions at Aldgate Ironworks, placed carefully in the right hands with the right framing, in the right publications, could change those calculations. He said it would not free anyone immediately. He said it was not designed to free anyone immediately. He said it was not designed to free anyone immediately. It was designed to make it more expensive to keep things the way they were, and to make that cost go up steadily over time until it exceeded the cost of changing. Marsh was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he thought Solomon had been planning this for longer than the past year. Solomon said he had been planning it for approximately 9 years, since the evening in January of 1844, when he had stood at his furnace and listened to a contract negotiation through a thin wall. Marsh said that was either extraordinary patience or extraordinary anger, and he was not sure there was a difference. Solomon said there wasn't. They worked together over the following months to shape the document into something that could be used in the way Solomon intended. Marsh had contacts at 2 abolitionist newspapers, one in Pittsburgh and one in Philadelphia, that had been publishing accounts of conditions in Southern industrial operations with increasing frequency as the political temperature around slavery rose. He also had a contact at a commercial publication in New York that covered the iron trade and whose readership included the buyers and investors whose contracts Aldgate depended on. The account appeared first in the Pittsburgh paper in September of 1853, 2 years almost to the month after Solomon had walked away from the ironworks. It was published under a pseudonym that bore no resemblance to Solomon's name, and that could not be traced back to him through any chain of evidence that Aldgate's lawyers could follow. It described conditions at a Virginia ironworks identified only by the county and the nature of its operation, conditions that were documented with a specificity and a consistency that made it read not like advocacy, but like testimony, like a record kept by someone who had been there for a long time and had understood, while they were there, that records would matter later. The commercial publication in New York picked up elements of the account 6 weeks later, framing it around questions of supply chain integrity that its readership of iron buyers and investors found relevant in a very direct and financial way. The question it raised, carefully and without overt political language, was whether the competitive pricing of iron from certain Virginia foundries reflected actual production efficiency, or reflected instead a systematic externalization of costs onto human beings who had no capacity to refuse to bear them. It was a question framed in the language of commerce rather than the language of justice. And it was, for exactly that reason, considerably more dangerous to Cornelius Aldgate than anything framed in the language of justice would have been. Because the buyers who read that question in the New York publication read it with the particular attention of people who were already navigating a shifting political landscape, people who were watching the temperature rise between North and South and calculating, as people of commerce always calculate, where the costs were going to fall and how to position themselves before they did. The question of whether their Virginia iron suppliers' pricing was built on a foundation that was about to become politically and commercially untenable was a question they took seriously. Several of them began asking their own questions. Several of those questions made their way back to Aldgate in the form of contract review requests and pricing inquiries that had a new and pointed quality to them. Aldgate recognized the pattern. He had enough intelligence and enough experience of the world to understand that what was happening to his business relationships in the North was not random. Someone was doing this. Someone who knew his operation well enough to describe it in the specific terms that had appeared in that Pittsburgh paper, terms that he had read and recognized with the cold certainty of a man reading an accurate account of his own life. He thought about the reward notice. He thought about the $1,200. He thought about the riders he had sent north and the letters he had written to contacts in Philadelphia and Baltimore and the complete and total silence that had come back from all of it. He was beginning to understand that the man he had owned for 12 years had not simply left. He had left and then turned around. He was somewhere out there in the North, beyond Aldgate's reach, and he was working. Steadily and patiently and with an intelligence that Aldgate was only now, at this distance and this cost, beginning to fully appreciate. He raised the reward again. He sent a man to Pittsburgh specifically to make inquiries. The man came back with nothing useful, because Solomon was not in Pittsburgh. He was in Harwick, teaching school on Saturdays and working at Grierson's foundry and reading law books by lamplight. And the only people who knew exactly where he was were people who had every reason in the world to keep that knowledge to themselves. The winter of 1853 moved into 1854 the way winters do in western Pennsylvania, slowly and with a gray stubbornness that makes the eventual arrival of spring feel like something that has been argued for and won rather than simply happened. Solomon taught through it and worked through it, and in the evenings he read and wrote and maintained the careful correspondence that had become the connective tissue of everything he was building, letters that traveled along the same networks that people had traveled along, through the hands of people who understood what they were carrying and why it mattered. The network was the thing he had spent the most time thinking about in the years before he left Aldgate, not the escape route, which was important but finite, a problem with a solution that ended when he crossed into Pennsylvania. The network was different. The network was ongoing. It was the infrastructure of the thing he was building, the system of connections and relationships and trusted contacts that allowed information to move from Virginia to Pennsylvania and resources to move from Pennsylvania toward Virginia and pressure to be applied at the points where it would do the most good. He had not built it alone. No one builds a network alone. What he had done was identify the people who were already building pieces of it and find ways to connect those pieces to each other and to the larger purpose he was working toward. Clara in Richmond, Aldous Fenn's contacts in Virginia, which overlapped with the network Cale Cross had been part of, and which extended further south and east than Fenn himself perhaps realized. Theodore Marsh in Pittsburgh, the editors of the two newspapers that had published the account of Aldgate's ironworks, a free black minister in Philadelphia named Cornelius Webb, who had spent 20 years building a congregation that was also in the practical way of institutions that serve people with nowhere else to turn, a clearinghouse for information and resources, and the kind of quiet assistance that does not appear in any official record. Solomon met Webb in the spring of 1854, traveling to Philadelphia for the first time since his arrival in Pennsylvania 2.5 years earlier. He went to hear Webb preach on a Sunday morning and stayed to talk afterward, and the conversation that began in the church that afternoon continued over 2 days in Webb's study and established the foundation of a collaboration that would last for the better part of a decade. Webb was a different kind of mind from Solomon, more expansive where Solomon was precise, more comfortable with ambiguity where Solomon preferred clarity, better at the kind of broad human connection that draws people in and makes them want to contribute to something larger than themselves. Solomon recognized immediately that what Webb could do was something he could not do himself, and he valued it with the unsentimental practicality of a man who has learned that the most important skill is knowing what you lack and finding the people who have it. They talked about what was possible, not in the abstract, not in the language of hope or aspiration, but in the specific practical terms that both of them preferred. What resources existed? What connections could be made? What pressure could be brought and where and how? Webb had been thinking about these questions for 20 years and had developed a sophisticated understanding of the landscape that complemented Solomon's more focused and more recent analysis. Where Solomon saw systems and their specific vulnerabilities, Webb saw people and their specific motivations, and between those two kinds of seeing they could identify, with a precision that neither could have achieved alone, the places where action was most likely to produce result. They identified 3 priorities. The first was the ongoing pressure on Aldgate and operations like it, the commercial and reputational campaign that the Pittsburgh and New York publications had begun, and that needed to be sustained and expanded if it was going to change enough minds to matter. The second was legal, not the direct case that Marsh had told Solomon was not yet possible, but the preparation for it, the accumulation of documented evidence and legal argument that would be ready when the political climate shifted enough to make direct action viable. The third was the most immediate and the most personal, the 37 people still at Aldgate Ironworks. Solomon had not forgotten them for a single day since he left. He had thought about them with the specific and detailed attention of a man who knows people not as a category but as individuals, knows their names and their histories and their particular situations and what each of them would need in order to have any chance of getting out. He had maintained through the network a current picture of conditions at the ironworks, who were still there and who had been sold or had died and who had arrived since he left, and that picture had been updated regularly enough that he knew the place almost as well from Pennsylvania as he had known it from inside. What he and Webb began to plan that spring was not a mass escape. That was not possible, and they both knew it. What they planned was something more patient and more targeted, a series of individual and small group movements, each one carefully prepared and specifically timed, using routes and contacts that they spent months putting in place before the first person moved. The first person to move was a man named George. He was in his mid-30s, had been at the ironworks for 8 years, and had a wife and 2 children at a plantation in Spotsylvania County, from whom he had been separated when Aldgate purchased him. Solomon had known George at the ironworks. He had trusted him there in the careful, limited way that people trust each other in dangerous places, knowing that the trust is real, but that it operates within constraints that have nothing to do with the character of the person being trusted. George moved in the autumn of 1854, 3 years after Solomon had left. He moved along a route that Solomon and Webb had prepared, through contacts who had been notified and were ready, with a document in his pocket whose language and handwriting Solomon had spent 2 weeks on. He reached Pennsylvania in 11 days without being stopped. He arrived in Philadelphia on a Thursday evening, and Cornelius Webb was at the door of the church when he got there. Solomon was in Harwick when he got the letter, telling him George had arrived. He read it twice. Then he put it down on the table in Patience Arnold's kitchen and sat with it for a while. Patience, who was at the stove and who had learned over 3 years to read Solomon's silences the way you learn to read weather, did not ask him what the letter said. She just put a cup of coffee on the table beside him and went back to the stove. After a while, he told her. Not everything, the outline. She listened without turning around. When he finished, she said, still facing the stove, that she had wondered how long it would take him to get started on that. He asked her what she meant. She said she had known from the first week he was in her house that he had not come to Harwick to rest. She said a man who reads law books by lamplight every evening for 3 years is not resting. He is getting ready. He said he supposed that was accurate. She said she supposed it was too, and that she hoped he was careful, and that she would appreciate it if whatever he was doing did not bring trouble to her door, but that she also understood that some things were more important than a quiet house, and she was old enough to know the difference. He looked at her back for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She said he was welcome and told him his coffee was getting cold. Over the following 2 years, 11 more people moved from Aldgate Iron Works along the routes that Solomon and Webb had built. Not all at once, not in a pattern that would be visible to anyone watching from outside, in ones and twos and at intervals that were calculated to avoid the kind of systematic disappearance that would trigger the intense and organized response that a mass escape would have provoked. Each movement was prepared individually, timed to a specific set of conditions at the ironworks, using a specific route and a specific set of contacts chosen for that person's particular situation. Aldgate noticed the losses. He could not help notice the losses. He could not help noticing them. But he could not identify a pattern that pointed to an organized effort, because Solomon and Webb had been careful to ensure that no single loss looked like anything other than an individual deciding to run. The ordinary and constant and individual explicable thing that enslaved people did and had always done. The losses were painful to Aldgate in the practical, operational sense. More men whose skills and labor had walked away from his furnaces, more costs to replace them, more disruption to the operation that was already struggling with the commercial pressure that the newspaper accounts had created in the north. He raised the reward for Solomon one more time. $1,500 posted in the spring of 1855. The largest reward ever posted for a single escaped enslaved person in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was the act of a man who understood at some level that he could not fully articulate even to himself that the thing he was experiencing was not random, that it had a source, that the source was specific and intentional, and had been working against him with a patience and a precision that he found when he allowed himself to think about it directly, genuinely frightening. He never found Solomon, not in 1855, not ever. What he found instead in the spring of 1856 was a lawsuit. Theodore Marsh filed it in the Federal District Court in Pittsburgh on behalf of 7 former workers at Aldgate Iron Works, all of them now in Pennsylvania, all of them named, all of them represented by Marsh with the same dry precision he brought to everything, and with a body of documented evidence that had been assembled over 4 years with the thoroughness of a man who had known from the beginning that the moment to use it was coming, and had made sure that when it came everything was ready. The case was not a freedom case. Freedom had already been achieved for the people who brought it by the simple fact of their presence in Pennsylvania. It was a damages case. It argued that the conditions at Aldgate Iron Works had constituted a systematic and documented pattern of treatment that had caused specific and quantifiable harm to specific individuals, harm that could be expressed in terms that a federal court in Pennsylvania could address, regardless of the legal status those individuals had held in Virginia at the time the harm was done. It was, like Iris's case before it, an argument that found the crack in the wall of a system built on the assumption that the people it was designed to contain could never use it against the person who built it. It was not airtight. Marsh had never told Solomon it was airtight. He had told him it was sound enough to file and sound enough to argue, and that the act of filing it in federal court and the publicity that would follow from that filing would itself constitute a form of pressure that was separate from and additional to whatever the court eventually decided. He was right about that. The filing was reported in 3 newspapers within a week, including the New York commercial publication that had already raised questions about Aldgate's operation 2 years earlier. The story it told this time was more specific and more damaging, because now there were named plaintiffs and a federal case number and a lawyer of record, and the combination of those things transformed what had been a question about supply chain ethics into something that buyers and investors found considerably harder to set aside. 2 more of Aldgate's northern contracts were terminated in the months following the filing. The buyers cited the usual reasons: pricing adjustments, supplier consolidation, the ordinary language of commercial decisions. Solomon read the termination notices in letters from Marsh and understood them for what they were. The case was eventually settled in the autumn of 1857 for an amount that Marsh described to Solomon in a letter as meaningful, without being what justice actually required, which is a description that fits most of what law produces in an unjust world, and which Solomon received with the equanimity of a man who had never expected the law to do more than it was capable of doing. He had expected it to do something. It had done something. He recorded that in the same internal ledger where he recorded everything else, and moved forward. Cornelius Aldgate died in 1859. He died of causes that his doctor described as consistent with prolonged stress and cardiovascular deterioration, which is a medical way of saying that the accumulated weight of what had been done to his certainty and his business and his understanding of how the world was organized had taken a physical toll that his body eventually could not sustain. He left behind a foundry that was operating at less than half the capacity of its peak years, a business reputation that had been significantly and permanently damaged in the northern markets he had depended on, and 2 sons who would sell the ironworks within 3 years of inheriting it because they could not make it profitable and did not understand why. Solomon was 36 years old when Aldgate died. He was still in Harwick. He was still teaching school. He had bought, the previous year, a small house on the same street as Patience Arnold, who was now in her 70s and whose health had begun the slow decline of the very old. And he looked in on her every morning and brought her coffee and sat with her for a while before he went to the foundry or the school, because she had given him a room when he needed one and had understood without being told what he was doing, and had told him his coffee was getting cold when he needed that too. And those things deserved to be repaid in the unruply anteed. Did it and stale. She died in the winter of 1860, in her own house, in her own bed, with Solomon sitting in the chair beside her. She did not say anything at the end. She had said everything she had to say over the previous 8 years in the practical and economical way. She said everything, without waste and without performance. He sat with her for a while after she was gone, in the cold quiet of the January morning, and then he got up and went to tell the neighbors and to do what needed to be done. He taught school for another 12 years after that. The students who passed through his classroom in Harwick, white and black, the children of foundry workers and farmers and shopkeepers, carried what he taught them for the rest of their lives. The habit of asking why a thing was the way it was, the understanding that every system has a logic and every logic has a limit, the knowledge absorbed without being directly stated that the most important work is often the work that takes the longest, and that the people who do it are rarely the people who get the credit for it in the accounts that history keeps. He never went back to Virginia. There was nothing there to go back to. What he had taken from Virginia he had taken completely, and what he had left there he had left deliberately. And the distance between those 2 things was the distance of a whole life rebuilt from the ground up, in a place where the ground was not solid, but was at least not actively hostile, which is sometimes all the ground you get, and you learn to build on it anyway. The reward notice stayed on the courthouse post in Richmond for 3 years before someone took it down. $1,500 for a man named Solomon Greer, 6 feet and 2 inches tall, gray or possibly green eyes depending on the light, not to be approached alone under any circumstances. extremely intelligent. The last adjective on the list, the one that Cornelius Oldgate had added, and that everyone who read the notice noted and remembered long after they had forgotten the height and the scar and the eye color. Extremely intelligent. It was the most accurate thing Oldgate ever said about him. It was also, in a way he had not intended when he wrote it, a confession, because you do not warn people that a man is extremely intelligent unless you have already learned at significant cost to yourself exactly what that intelligence is capable of. The warning was the proof. The reward was the record, and the fact that the reward was never collected was the verdict. Solomon Greer was never caught. He was never returned to Virginia. He was never brought back to Oldgate Ironworks or to any other place that claimed ownership of him. He lived in Harwick, Pennsylvania, and taught school and worked at a foundry and read law books by lamplight, and maintained a network of connections that moved people and information and resources along routes that the people who wanted to stop it could never fully map, because the man who designed it had designed it to be unmappable, had built into its structure the same distributed redundancy he had built into the iron production process. No single point of failure, no thread that if pulled unravel everything. He had learned that from iron, from the years at the furnace, from the understanding of what makes a material strong, from the knowledge that strength is not the absence of weakness but the distribution of it, the arrangement of a structure so that no single stress point bears more than it can hold. He had been built to be broken. The system that owned him had been designed for exactly that purpose, refined over generations for exactly that purpose, and it was very good at its purpose. It had broken many people. It had broken people stronger and older and more resourced than a young man from Spotsylvania County who arrived at a Petersburg ironworks in the spring of 1839 with nothing but the contents of his own mind. It had not broken Solomon Greer. And the reason it had not broken him was not that he was harder than the people it had broken. It was that he had understood something about the system early enough and clearly enough to use that understanding before the system could complete its work. He had understood that the system's confidence in its own permanence was its greatest weakness, that the people who built it and maintained it and profited from it believed so completely in its indestructibility that they had stopped looking for the places where it could be taken apart, and so they had left those places unguarded. And Solomon had found them, and he had stood at his furnace for 7 years, and he had taken the system apart from the inside, piece by piece and year by year, with a patience that the system's designers had not thought to defend against, because they had not thought it was possible. $1,500. That was what Cornelius Oldgate decided Solomon Greer was worth when he was trying to get him back. He was wrong about that, too. He had been wrong about it from the beginning. You cannot put a number on what Solomon Greer was worth, because what Solomon Greer was worth was not a thing that numbers measure. It was a thing that you measure in the 11 people who moved north along routes he built, in the students who carried his habit of mind into lives he never saw, in the lawsuit that made a federal court in Pittsburgh acknowledge that something had happened at Oldgate Ironworks that the law was obligated to address, in the contracts that were cancelled and the certainties that were dismantled, and the comfortable belief in permanence that was replaced, in one man and then in the minds of everyone watching, with the knowledge of the dent it did end. He was never caught. He was never found. He lived his life in Harwick, Pennsylvania, and taught school, and the children learned, and the network held, and the work continued long after any individual piece of it was visible to anyone looking in from outside. And somewhere in Virginia, on a post outside a courthouse in Richmond, a reward notice weathered through 3 winters and was eventually taken down by someone who needed the paper for something else, and the name on it faded, and the number faded. And what remained was the ghost of a warning that had never been heeded, and a price that had never been paid, and the man who had walked away on a moonless night in September and had never been paid, and a man who had walked away on a moonless night in September and had never, not for a single day, stod walk.